Oso Mauniuiak. Hello and welcome back, everybody, to the final day of the summit. We hope you all have engaged in meaningful dialogue and have had some good networking opportunities. Today, we will be arranged a little bit differently. We'll be starting with our breakout sessions, followed by our closing keynote speaker, Basile Panic. Then we will end with some closing remarks from our event organizer, Sarah Smith. And then a traveling song by the Wolf River Singers. Finally, we would like to remind folks of the special Earth Day event that will be occurring tomorrow, right here on Pathable, hosted by the College of Menominee Nation Sustainable Development Institute. And now, on to our final keynote of Shifting Seasons 3.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started with our session today so that we can make the best use of our time together. First, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Marta Lyons, an ecologist with the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, currently in Minneapolis on Dakota homeland. I want to thank everyone for joining us this morning on our Animal Relatives panel. Especially want to thank our speakers. We have a really great panel with a lot of expertise. Our panel will focus on how is climate change altering access to culturally significant animal relatives and how can we increase resiliency. I want to encourage audience participation in this session. So please feel free to post any questions that you think of in either the Zoom or the meeting chat on the Pathable site. And thank you, Colleen Cooley, for monitoring these chats for us. So I want to quickly remind everyone to mute your microphones, the audience. So to get started, I will briefly introduce each panelist and then invite them to add more background about themselves and their work. So first, we have Dr. Olivia LeDee. Dr. LeDee is the acting director of the Department of the Interior Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. For the past 13 years, Dr. LeDee has worked closely with state and federal agencies and non-governmental organizations to understand emerging conservation issues and prepare for change. She has worked for the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, providing technical, policy, and decision support on contentious issues and emerging threats, including climate change. Prior to recent creation of the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, she was the deputy director of the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. Thank you for joining us, Olivia.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. I'm looking forward to this discussion today. We have a cozy group. I am going to start out talking about briefly about impacts to animal relatives, but really focusing on climate adaptation today. So, we're all here because we're all aware that we are talking about unprecedented change to our systems, to fish, wildlife, plants, communities, and ecosystems. With broad implications, we're talking about shifting the timing of life events that often there is a close association with communities, be it for hunting, for fishing, for ceremonies, right? So shift in timing of events, shifts in the distribution of key plant and animal relatives that may or may not align with the current place that communities are distributed in space and time. Reductions in populations, which means loss of a resource for food. Poor health and disease. Oh, that one was not updated. So just to say stress, poor health, and disease, right? So animal relatives are experiencing physiological stress. We can see it in cortisol levels, poor health, and we're seeing disease outbreaks as well as local loss, complete loss of individual species or relatives that have strong identity for peoples, for communities, especially if we think about boreal wildlife. So a couple positive notes, right? Animal relatives, plants have the ability to adjust or adapt to these changes through adaptive capacity. Dr. Kimmer spoke about this yesterday, right? And how we can learn from them in their adaptive capacity. In that, we can talk about climate adaptation, where we are taking actions on behalf of animal relatives, parent relatives, these communities, to respond or prepare for changes and to reduce the negative impacts or how we perceive them as being negative impacts to communities. So I'm really going to focus on climate adaptation today, what we can do. And I just want to talk about a few things that is within sort of the purview, the authority of lots of people, individuals, smaller communities, because often we talk about these big strategies that, again, if we think about mitigation or things that are often outside of our purview, which makes us feel like we aren't able to do anything about climate change, we aren't able to offer any protection or refuge for animal relatives. And just want to counter that by saying there are many things that we can do on a local level that are important, and again, to reduce some of these negative impacts of climate change on fish, wildlife, and plants. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is just promoting a wildlife-friendly landscape and our ability to work with private landowners, right? So animals are going through these inhospitable landscapes. Can we offer a little bit of additional resource, food, be it pollinator food, other local native species for landscaping, right, to provide cover. So working with private landowners to improve the suitability of their gardens and yards for animals. We can do this on a larger scale if you think about agriculture by offering conservation easements, or if we think about municipalities and towns, cities, thinking more about green infrastructure. So even if it is not sort of these large protected areas, can we buffer a little bit more? And the answer is yes, we can. Then also just thinking about barriers to movement, removing fences, and other barriers that prevent sort of the natural behavioral changes that organisms might use to adapt to some of the stresses due to climate change. So promoting a wildlife-friendly matrix or wildlife-friendly landscape. We can also provide food, water, and cover. You know, we can restore habitat at a local scale, at a site scale, a particular protected area with diverse food and cover sources, shelter sources. We could provide nesting and living structures. So the example that I often like to use is for the black tern that's been in decline, right? They nest in these wetlands and they are very vulnerable to heavy rainfall events. But if we put out nesting platforms, they will use those and they will be successful. So that's one example of an animal relative that we can confer some protection under the stresses of heavy rainfall due to climate change. Again, making sure there's adequate vegetation cover to protect from temperature extremes. If we start thinking about some of the invertebrates, the butterflies. We can also create food plots and water reservoirs. So folks, our colleagues who are dealing in drought-stricken areas are already providing water reserves. For all of these things, we also need to think about disease dynamics and how to reduce those. But again, very important things that we can do. And then engaging human communities, right? We can create monitoring programs, citizen science programs that get people out valuing and seeing changes in the abundance, the distribution of animal relatives, providing guidance to local landowners. So if you might not necessarily be directly planting, but providing advice and guidance on how they might improve their local site for fish, wildlife, and plants. Providing opportunities for wildlife interaction. So we were talking about this, yes, in our water session, sort of just providing space for engagement with water, recognizing the value leading to greater appreciation, and providing opportunities for community management as well of resources, as we see it's often done in Latin America, in Africa. So providing opportunities for community management of the resource. And then we can also think about managing relationships across species. I mentioned the concern about disease dynamics under climate change, sort of having that on the radar and being concerned about that as a real threat to our future, and sort of starting surveillance programs. Thinking about harvest levels and, is this population severely stressed due to climate change, and do we want to think about different needs for our community in terms of harvest. How we balance non-local beings, right? Their presence and how it affects those local native animals. Moving populations, so translocations, if we think about grouse, to increase the population, or reintroduce species lost to the area, which some of those conversations have already begun underway. But I'd be remiss to say, and if I didn't acknowledge that the idea of protecting important areas is one of the strategies that folks often talk about, right? Creating new reserves, protecting refugia, increasing connectivity, protecting breeding areas, et cetera, protecting areas of high diversity, and right. And the act of creating new reserves has a very large colonial legacy, and the idea of protecting areas and increasing connectivity also, and the inability for some communities to do that because of the perpetuation of colonialism, is important to recognize and to talk about, because it reflects key strategies to protect animal relatives under climate change that not all communities hold that ability equally. And so it's something that we should talk about, that and in any of the other strategies that require large engagement and movement outside of your traditional community bounds. So that said, I can sort of speak to sort of what we are able to do as a center, and what we're hoping to do, and sort of just reflecting sort of in the tribal adaptation menu, right? Working with partners to manage at-risk beings as being important. And we take that seriously in terms of working with partners at the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. And so now we're in the process of engaging government to government with tribal nations in the region, offering consultation, offering engagement on our advisory committee and others. We work with the College of Menominee Nation and the Bureau of Indian Affairs with a tribal resilience liaison to understand information needs of tribal communities in the region, offer some technical assistance. We also support the Northeast Indigenous Climate Resilience Network. If you're not familiar with it, encourage you to learn more about it. Launching priority research projects on issues that are important to communities in the region, and offer workshops and technical assistance for folks who are interested. So please, seek us out if you're interested as a resource for connection and building partnerships to improve our ability collectively to respond to climate change. And then just wanted to point out a few resources for folks who are interested in taking additional steps in thinking about animal relatives specifically, or ecosystems specifically, in response to climate change. So the BIA Tribal Resilience Program does a call for proposals, typically every other year. Wildlife Conservation Society's Climate Adaptation Fund is really interested on the ground implementation projects. So if you have a plan or have an idea of what you'd like to do, that's a great resource. Tribal Wildlife Grants Program through Fish and Wildlife Service, and National Park Service's Tribal Heritage Grants programs. And then University of Oregon maintains a site. If you just Google University of Oregon Tribal Climate Change Guide, they have a suite of funding opportunities from NGOs, foundations, federal government, state government, federal government, I'm not sure about state government, and talks about eligibility. So I encourage you to look at that resource as well. But thank you for your time and looking forward to the conversation today.
Thank you, Olivia. So next up, we have Hannah Panci, who is a scientist in the climate change program at the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. She spends a lot of time thinking about how to use both traditional knowledge and mainstream science in climate adaptation. Her primary projects at the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission include a phenology study, seed bank collection project, and climate change vulnerability assessment. Thank you, Hannah.
Bonjour, everybody. Hannah Panci, Indigenous Eagle River, and Dunjaba, Ironwood, Michigan, Ninda, Gouin, and Dudu Damasi, Glyphwick, and Nanoki. My name is Hannah Panci. I'm not a tribal member, but I like to use the teeny tiny amount of Ojibwe I know when introducing myself. So Glyphwick is an intertribal agency that supports our 11 Ojibwe member tribes in the implementation of treaty rights they retain to hunt, fish, and gather off reservation in the 4 ceded territories shown on the map. We work as co-managers with other natural resource agencies within those ceded territory boundaries. So we all know tribes are disproportionately affected by climate change. They rely directly on treaty resources for survival and for cultural identity. And all beings will be affected by climate change in some way. Many that have been relied on for thousands of years will decrease in abundance or shift their ranges and make it harder to find these culturally important beings. Climate change impacts to these beings threaten generations of cultural knowledge that has been developed through thousands of years of observation. And here's an audio clip from Carmen Butler of St. Croix sharing his perspectives on climate change.
2 weeks before it freezes is when the tulipies hit, and they run until it freezes during that 2-week time. So if the climate change makes this 2-week thing start 2 months ahead of time, a lot of my people back in the day are the ones of us that like to do this are going to get messed up big time. Climate change did that. The walleyes, the northerns and suckers, that they don't see them things up there when they're supposed to, that messes up all the way down the line somewhere, huh? What was the other one? Them 4 times and snow comes. If it only comes 3 times now, a lot of these stories that we tell in Chippewa country to our children to help relate these things, I become a liar, or maybe a bullshitter, whatever you want to say. When I try to explain something to them in a good way that'll give them life, they're going to believe me. Yeah, you told me you're going to do this 4 times, but you're wrong. But my grandma and grandpas before them, they knew this. And that's why they're still here, because they didn't have no weatherman, TV, or radio to do these things or show you. So that's how climate change, what I see about it, it affects our stories. It affects when we hunt, where we fish. And it has a great deal of effect to us.
So at Glyphwick, we've been working on a vulnerability assessment, version 1 shown in the lower left here, working on version 2 released later this year. And we're incorporating both traditional knowledge and mainstream science, looking at over 60 different beings. And we're looking at different aspects of each being's natural history to help us understand how best to help them withstand climate changes. So shown here are all the animal relatives that were categorized as either highly or extremely vulnerable in our assessment. So the ranges are likely to decrease even by mid-century. And these are all culturally important beings that tribes have had relationships with for generations. So just a little snapshot from our results. We're looking at average vulnerability scores for 4 different categories of beings commonly used by the Ojibwe: crawlers, flyers, swimmers, and 4-leggeds. So the higher the scores, the more vulnerable the group. And I just wanted to point out, just looking at the solid black line is the average score. Swimmers were the most vulnerable category of those four. One example related to what Carmen was talking about earlier, this is an indicator that was brought up by tribal members during interviews, mentioned that when popple leaves were as big as a quarter or beaver's ears, the suckers would run. And it was also mentioned that this indicator started changing about 15 years ago, and now they don't always occur at the same time. So because the timing of these has been impacted, that cultural knowledge no longer holds, and it will make successful harvesting that much more difficult. Waboos is a good example, snowshoe hare, a good example of a being, lots of traditional knowledge, lots of Western science related to this being. So models have shown this being's range contracting northward and projecting that to continue into the future, showing 1980 on the left to the mid-century on the right. And in interviews, tribal members have been mentioning seeing population declines for about the past 15 years or so, and linking that to a decline in snowfall. So tribal members fear that traditional knowledge and stories about waboos will soon just be memories, and that younger generations will never see a waboos in their backyard. And so as climate change causes these beings to move, treaty rights to hunt, fish, and gather in the ceded territories are geographically fixed and cannot move with them. So that's just one of the ways that climate change will restrict access and relationships with these animal relatives. Just a note when thinking about helping animal relatives, in the past, decisions for use of our relatives were communal decisions made with recognition, acknowledgement, and reciprocity throughout. Today, management and decision-making for land and the environment is often made by individuals, agencies, and institutions. So I guess partly in response to that, Glyphwick, along with many other partners shown at the bottom, developed a tool to kind of help us return to that original model. So Debugin-Jagadig, Anishinaabe, Ejutwad, our tribal adaptation menu, or TAM, as we call it. Some of you may have said in the adaptation menu session yesterday. If you didn't, this is a tool for tribes and tribal partners to use to approach climate adaptation from an Indigenous lens. So the next few slides are all strategies or approaches from the TAM, and they're just a good lens to start from when thinking about helping animal relatives. So the first three strategies from the adaptation menu all deal with culture in some way. First, consider cultural practices and seek spiritual guidance. Learn through careful and respectful observation, or Gakinawabe. And support tribal engagement in the environment. So I want to just point out that second one a little bit. This one purposefully addresses the fact that doing nothing can, in fact, be an action. So sitting back and learning from those animal relatives instead of needing to act. Learning from them, the lessons they have to share, who they are, how they live, all of these things will help us take care of those who take care of us. A couple other things from those three strategies, things like using traditional knowledge to guide adaptation actions and using the deep knowledge found in the native languages themselves to learn about our relatives that way. A few other strategies from the adaptation menu, and a lot of these overlap with what Olivia already mentioned, but sustain fundamental ecological and cultural functions, reduce the impact of biological and anthropogenic stressors, establish, support, and recognize opportunities for beings of concern to the community to withstand climate change, and increase ecosystem redundancy and promote connectivity across the landscape. So all, again, pretty general, but applicable to a lot of different situations when thinking about helping animal relatives. Above all, I think any adaptation actions we undertake to help those beings, we need to do it with respect, reciprocity, and with a good heart. And I have a quote from Pat Northrup related to that.
That's why I think you have to have a good heart to learn the language. And I think that all goes with everything. Everything you do, you gotta have a good heart. If like all the traditional things that we do, like from sugar bush to wild rice to planting gardens to planting tobacco or whatever you're doing, you have to have that a whole heart respect for it, because it's given to us by the Creator. He's making it possible, and all you have to do is you have to put the effort into it.
Okay, and with that, I'll just say Miigwech Bizendawi. Thank you for listening to me. I'd like to say Chi Miigwech to other people that have worked on this project. Rob and Melanie are also on this call. And to all of the elders, harvesters, and other knowledge holders who have contributed knowledge to our climate change projects.
Thank you so much, Hannah, for that great talk. So next up, we have Mitzi Reed, who serves as the Director of Choctaw Wildlife and Parks, as well as the Tribal Biologist for the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians. She has been employed with the Mississippi Choctaws for the last 20 years within the environmental and wildlife programs. She's taken the lead in the reestablishment of the Choctaw Youth Conservation Corps to promote the importance of introducing tribal youth to various fields of study in natural resources and conservation. She also serves as one of the Southeast directors and Secretary Treasurer for the Native American Fish and Wildlife Society's Board of Directors and the Mississippi Chapter Secretary Treasurer for the Wildlife Society. Let's see. Great. And Mitzi, are you able to?
Yes.
Great. I will turn off
All
my
right.
video.
All right. Thank you. And if you excuse me, I'm going to keep my video off as well because I am in a mobile office. So as much technical support as I can get, I think it's going to be a plus. When I was approached with this topic, I was, climate change is something that I've just come into recently. So I wanted to cover a couple of things because when you search the words climate change, if your internet firewalls allow you to, you're overwhelmed with the various papers and posts and different pathways. Oftentimes terms like resiliency and adaptation, they tend to be used interchangeably, but it's important to understand the differences in order to devise the plans if there's going to be management and outreach. So if we go on to the next slide, a little bit about myself. Born and raised in Mississippi on the Choctaw Indian Reservation here. I received my bachelor's and master's at the University of West Alabama, which is only about an hour from our reservation. So I stay pretty close to home. Again, I do have 20 plus years in both the environmental and wildlife fields, all for Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians. And you see the boards that I'm on, but I also am an amateur wildlife photographer. I go out and just do all these little snapshots, and I can't even remember what the word I want to say now. Also, I'm a bass fisherman and a snake lover, but I threw my disclaimer in there under my picture there. I am in no way an expert on anything that I'm saying, but I think it's going to be fairly entertaining. I know it was entertaining as far as researching it. So next slide, please. So when it comes to resiliency, resiliency is basically the concept of bouncing back from some type of event. Here in Mississippi, we don't really get many cold days. And to experience a whole week long of ice storms in February, that was quite an experience for us. And then adaptation is going to happen regardless. That's just the adjustment to actual or expected future changes. So you see the information I have up on there. Climate change effects on the ecosystems are caused by interchanges of multiple processes. So as understanding of climate change evolves, so does the understanding of what needs to be done. It's important not to use these terms interchangeably, but in coordination with each other. Not to mention all the other terms like mitigation, vulnerability. The terms go on and on. You also see so much work being devoted to existing systems, and that's a no-brainer because we want to protect what we have. But it also makes us a little bit more reactive versus proactive. So I think one of the components of being able to actually tackle some of our challenges are to be a little bit more proactive. But if it's one thing we know for sure, nature will always readjust and adapt. Sometimes it's not going to be the way we want it, and it may not be the way it was before, but it will adapt. So you see to the side there, I threw in my little Dr. Ian Malcolm quote there, that life will not be contained. Life breaks free and life finds a way. So if you're a Jurassic Park fan there, you know where I'm coming from there. Next slide, please. Concerns for Mississippi Band Choctaw Indians are listed below. It's fairly similar to what some of the concerns are for the state of Mississippi. We're definitely experiencing warmer air, warmer temperatures, increased storm activities. You see the picture there on the right. These are things that we see a lot more of lately. Sometimes 2, even 3 times a week, we see warnings like this, where we have frequency and intensity of storms, increased flooding. You know, we have wetland areas that are normally flooded maybe 2, 3 times a year. Now we're seeing times of flooding extending to about 6 to 7 times a year, and not just a day or 2 of flooding, but prolonged days of flooding. This is creating sedimentation in some of those flooded areas. We're seeing cultural significant plants that are susceptible to long periods of flooding. So we're having the concerns of our loss of native and culturally significant species. We have pathogens, parasites, disease spread. Chronic wasting disease has entered into Mississippi now. So there's so much more concerns. Then you have the spread of invasive species. Wild feral pigs in Mississippi is something that's not new, but we're starting to see it more and more, and even on a day-to-day basis. And so one of our biggest concerns, taking all that into account, one of our sensitive areas that of greatest concern to us right now are the wetlands. You see that wetland species, and you can go ahead and go to the next slide, please. Wetland species, both flora and fauna, are going to be part of our most vulnerable species. Changes in the wetland systems change more than just the change in the waterway. Wetlands are live filtering processes that are needed for healthy yet vulnerable ecosystems. And you see there, I've listed that our most vulnerable are aquatic animals, amphibians, reptiles, birds, fish, and it's because they're vulnerable to those altered temperatures. They're highly sensitive. Altered weather conditions can create biological changes. They actually can change the physical nature of the areas around there. Whenever a storm comes through, we have timber that falls all over. It actually change the physical composition of that area. Longer, warmer temperatures into the winter. We mainly get warm weather here. If we get cold snaps, it's usually a day or 2. But we're starting to see longer winter snaps now. So all of that takes into account and makes these animal relatives more vulnerable. And I mentioned the last three there in passing. So it's basically like a pebble in a pond scenario. Waves of destruction will only get larger and larger. Yet the smallest organisms are going to be the ones that are impacted first, and then move on up the food chain. So next slide, please. So with the discussions of climate change and talking about animal relatives, I wanted to bring light to our animal relatives, the reptiles. Reptiles are infected, can be affected multiple ways. Not only that, reptiles are one of my favorite groups. I mean, it's not uncommon to find me out with a camera, taking pictures. This is actually a picture of mine, the copperhead on top, where I'm out there taking photos as the snake sunbathing, or having to relocate an alligator from one of our community ponds. But their vulnerability, because they're a cold-blooded species, makes them a species or a group of animals that are of concern to me, because they're affected threefold. They encountered altered habitats, the sedimentation, the timber loss, introduction of undesired species of plants and animals, loss of the desired species that they're looking for. Take snakes. Snakes, they have a wide array of hibernacula when they need to go in and vermate. But if for some reason that home range of theirs has been physically altered, they tend to be pushed out. Or if their home ranges are flooded a substantial amount of times, they tend to be pushed out and displaced. And unfortunately, the areas they're finding are those around human residences. And so we have increased calls about, snakes in homes and things like that. The second one is they're temperature sensitive, cold-blooded species. They're impacted by the temperatures that are around them. And with those impacts and with those changes, there can be impacts on their biological patterns. Reproduction of alligators. Cooler nests create more males, warmer nests create more females. So if the temperatures are a lot hotter, we tend to have more females than males. So you take out the population balance there. Snakes may not be experiencing normal brumation as they used to. Instead of burmating for 2 to 3 months of a year, they may be only getting, if maximum, a month. Timing of key ecological events, the times that they breed, lay eggs, disperse, migrate. There's changes because of a lot of these impacts, whether it be physical changes or just changes that are affecting their biological patterns. And then the last one, they're susceptible to increasing frequency and intensity of storms. Again, being displaced from their home ranges. Next slide, please. So what would our defense strategies be? The last two presentations alluded to a lot of this. The first one is to assess the situation. You basically have to know what you have and able to be able to take care of what you have. Observation is the key. So we've got to be able to observe and physically observe what's going on and not just take a guess of what could be impacting the area. Habitat enhancements, removing undesirables. If there's a spread of an invasive plant, such as here on the reservation, we're having issues with things like Chinese privet that is coming in and encroaching into areas of some of our culturally significant plants like swamp cane, or also known as river cane. Thinning out those areas, trying to remediate some of our cultural plants, opening up areas. If these things are processes that are necessary, even if it's timber thinning, doing some type of timber habitat improvements, so that we can take out some of the undesirables or take out some of the mass that's in there that will provide some of those desired plants to grow and to expand. Human involvement, education is the key. That's what's going to give you the bigger bang for your buck, basically. You know, you provide that outreach, you get people involved, you provide that understanding, because that understanding is what's going to help you with the support to be able to go forth. Active programs. You've got to have active, and I must add, adequately funded programs to keep things going. Grant funds are great. We've established a lot of pilot projects through grant funds, but if you don't have sustainable funding, how do you maintain those programs? Because they are viable programs, they are great programs, but you got to be able to create that. Some of our successes, I wanted to talk about 2 of our successes. We're in the process of expanding on our wetland classroom projects, where we have 2 areas that we utilize for wetland classrooms, basically. So we actively maintain these wetland areas so that we can have students come through and experience an active wetland, see what it's going to do, learn the processes of the wetland, learn more about it, and the importance of trying to maintain those areas. And the second program I wanted to highlight is our Choctaw Youth Conservation Corps, or CYCC. We utilize tribal youth to get them out there to help us do some of the work, the actual manual work, and providing the enhancements and the habitat expansions so that we can provide these areas to come back, and then utilize these kids and to pay them, and then also educate them to get them to pursue higher education in those processes. And then increase the protection. It was mentioned that it's not a fix the problem next day issue. It's actually a process that we've got to continue. And that's where our policies, that's where our managements and so forth continue on and on. So next slide there. I know I threw a lot at you, but if there's any questions, or there's my contact information, and I'll be happy to discuss more at a later date if need be. Thank you.
Thank you, Mitzi. Reptiles are my favorite too. So our last panelist is Eric Clark. Eric Clark is the lead wildlife biologist for the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians, where he has led the Inland Fish and Wildlife Department since 2008. He is also a doctoral student at Michigan State University in the Department of Fisheries and Wildlife. In 2019, he co-led the establishment of the Center for Cooperative Ecological Resilience, a collaboration between Michigan State University and the Sioux tribe. The CCER focuses on building tribal capacity for natural resources management, engaging academic researchers and educators in adaptive management of culturally important ecological resources, and providing graduate education opportunities for Sioux tribe members. Thank you, Eric. And then I think you're still muted, Eric. There.
Yeah, sorry, I couldn't find it. It jumped screens on me. Sorry. Yeah, so thank you. First, I'd like to just start by saying, I'm honored to be asked to speak here. I'm honored to represent the Sault Ste. Marie Tribe of Chippewa Indians here at the Shifting Season Summit. And I'm honored to be virtually here on the lands and waters in the Upper Great Lakes, the homelands of many great Anishinaabe communities, and I just really appreciate the opportunity. I want to talk to you today about teasing out climate change impacts in our work in our wildlife program over the last decade. that's really focused on reclaiming the role of reciprocity in our communities' ecological relationships. So with that, I want to provide a little bit of context to this talk first. So one thing about, so Sioux tribe is a really large tribe in terms of population. We have over 43,000 enrolled members. The map on your screen shows the distribution of those members in the state of Michigan, with populations centered in the northern lower peninsula and the eastern upper peninsula. We issue, our program tracks harvest by over 5,000 members every year. We issue over 150,000 individual permits to harvest hundreds of plants and wildlife species. And that harvest takes place literally in every corner of that 13.9 million acre, 1836 ceded territory. So I want to talk a little bit about how climate change is altering access to culturally significant species. You know, I think this is really complicated. I think it's really easy to, or I guess it's not always easy to draw a link between climate change, something that happens at this really large geographic and temporal scale, and to relate that to these small cumulative changes that community members see in their relationships with specific ecological systems. And conversely, I think it's also really easy to attribute changes in species distribution to climate when they're really more about the direct interaction that people are having with the ecosystems that they depend on. And so with that, for quite a few years, we've been working sort of in this realm of vulnerability assessments here at Sioux Tribe. This graphic is from a wildlife vulnerability assessment that we completed in 2017. This was for a suite of species that was developed through a community engagement process with our members, as well as sort of looking towards our department needs for information. I always like to say that, you know, there's some vulnerability assessments that are sort of wide and shallow and some that are narrow and deep. And I think we've erred on the narrow and deep side of things with these. We've used the system for assessing vulnerability of species that was developed by the Rocky Mountain Research Station with the United States Forest Service. And as you can see, you know, this graphic suggests, let me get my pointer out. You know, this graphic suggests that there's some species that may perform better under future climate scenarios, and there's some that seem like they're going to perform worse under these future climate scenarios. And what we tried to do with this graphic is represent uncertainty in our sort of expert panels with regard to this. And I guess one thing to sort of point out about this is these species that we think are going to perform poorly under climate change, future climate change scenarios, there's a whole lot of uncertainty around how that's going to occur or if it's going to occur. Whereas it seems like folks, the species that we think are going to perform better, it seems like there's quite a bit of certainty that leads us to those conclusions. And so, you know, thinking about how this sort of plays out in our membership's ability to access harvest, every year our members who get a license through the Sioux Tribe are required to report harvest. And so we've got this really nice data set that we can track harvest over time with. It covers, I think, 55 different wildlife species. And I just wanted to sort of highlight two of these groups of species. You know, we've got deer harvest over time from 2011 to 2017 on this top light gray bar, which is interesting because that's declining, I think, as a result of climate change, even though it's a species that's projected to sort of perform better under future climate change scenarios. And on the bottom is our snowshoe hare harvest over that same time series. And that seems like it's performing like you would expect. Interestingly enough, if you look at the graphic on the right, this is the winter severity index as compiled by the Midwest Regional Climate Center. And I took some liberties with how I combined some of these. I'm sure the actual climate scientists on the meeting would be shaking their head if I told them what I actually did. But leaving that aside, what you can see here is that this dark bar on the top is what the Midwest Regional Climate Center suggests is a extreme winter. And you can see that in the last decade, we've had a lot of days where or a lot of winters where our winters are in that extreme category. So, what does this mean for species and how in sort of how we can build resilience and increase resilience in these ecological communities that we think are really important. So to sort of to try to answer this question, or at least talk about Sioux Tribes, our wildlife program's approach to these issues, I want to focus on snowshoe hare and boreal forest ecosystems for a few reasons. First of all, snowshoe hare are just essential to Anishinaabe life for a whole lot of different reasons. Snowshoe hare are also kind of the poster, or one of the poster children for climate change vulnerability in mammals in the Great Lakes region. And I also think from our program's perspective, we've got a richer understanding of snowshoe hare than some of these other species, because we've invested a lot of time and energy trying to understand these snowshoe hare and their ecosystems. In fact, I started working for Sioux Tribe in 2008, and in July and in September, we submitted our first tribal wildlife grant for a snowshoe hare project. So it's sort of been something we've been working on really since our program started. So to sort of think about our approach, really, I think it boils down to, we're really trying to learn to work from multiple science frameworks. We're working to understand vulnerability, adaptation, and resilience from Anishinaabe science frameworks, while employing all these fancy Western science tools to really help us communicate these core ideas that we get from interacting with our community members. Anishinaabe science is relational and it's adaptive. And I think it does a better job at asking the right questions because they're steeped in this experience from time immemorial. I like to think about the fact that Anishinaabe science tends to understand the ecology of these systems from within, as opposed to pretending like we're on the outside, looking at this system that we're disconnected from. We're working to build capacity by fostering collaborative partnerships with large land managers like the Hiawatha National Forest. And as I said in my introduction, we've been working with Michigan State University to create the Center for Cooperative Ecological Resilience, which has as its mission to approach forest and wildlife ecology problems from both Anishinaabe and Western science perspectives. And so what does that look like for snowshoe hare for us? In 2015, really driven by community knowledge regarding snowshoe hare populations and declines in those that were collected through both harvest and effort reports from the membership, as well as specific projects aimed at qualitative analysis of forest and wildlife health issues. We produced these three pieces, and this was really our first climate change vulnerability assessment. We did the vulnerability assessment, but we felt like, back to that first graphic, one of the things that was really uneasy is there's so much uncertainty around, especially these climate vulnerable species. So in addition to producing the vulnerability assessment, we worked with Michigan State University to create a snowshoe hare needs assessment for our program, as well as a document that was aimed at understanding how to apply these sort of climate vulnerability assessments to landscape level forest and habitat management problems. And so for really for the last decade, we have spent a lot of time out catching hares, putting collars on hares, doing occupancy surveys, and I feel like we're finally starting to turn the corner on sort of gaining a little bit of understanding on some of the nuances of the relationship between snowshoe hare, climate, habitat, and population performance. And so this is just a really brief sort of preview of some work that we've got coming out soon. And so what these graphics show is that occupancy probability across all these 100 sites across northern Michigan is related, but positively to snow depth. So as snow depth increases, occupancy probability increases. But it's not just about snow. If you look at the proportion of the landscape that is forested wetland, it too has this positive association with occupancy probability. And at the same time, if we look at things like landscape fragmentation, those are negatively related to snowshoe hare occupancy. So I come back to like this. It's complicated, and really, snowshoe hare are vulnerable to climate change, but I think they're also really vulnerable to poorly informed habitat management. And that's really about how people interact with landscapes and how we manage those landscapes. And so to that end, I would sort of sum up all of this activity for Sioux Tribe is sort of to say that, there's all this knowledge balled up in Anishinaabe teachings about how these landscapes were formed and maintained, and how the people and their relationships to these ecosystems are really at the center of all of that. All of our work with snowshoe hare and all these other climate vulnerable species is really focused on sort of restoring this reciprocal or reciprocity between our community and the ecosystem it's a part of. And so we're working to try to use all these Western science tools to communicate this community knowledge that we can directly engage our community to sort of compile or to sort of I don't know what the right word is, but then to take that information and directly engage with large land managers to sort of to put those management priorities on the landscape. We're also working to restore our community's role in land management by just engaging those state and federal partners in the production of new management science and to actually put things on the ground in real time while we're gaining these understandings from our community and from the information. Examples of that are we've got a joint fire management planning process or joint adaptive fire management planning process with the Hiawatha National Forest that's aimed at developing new and sort of Anishinaabe-based prescriptions for fuels treatment in boreal forest ecosystems. We've been working with the Hiawatha National Forest to develop adaptive northern white cedar prescriptions focused on understanding fire, herbivory, and northern white cedar restoration, and also experimental aspen prescriptions designed to vary the amount of conifer leaf inside of aspen clear cuts. And so, like I said, all of that is really taking things that we've learned from the community and trying to put those into practice for other with other management agencies. And so with that, sorry, I think I went a little bit over. Miigwech, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Eric. And now I will invite all the panelists as they're able to, if they can, turn on their videos and we'll hopefully get some questions from the audience. We have about 15 more minutes or 25 that the Zoom is open. So feel free to put those in the chat. I guess I'll get started. I had a question. So our first keynote speaker, Dr. Daniel Wildcat, mentioned the possibility of northern tribes learning from southern tribes. as future conditions in northern regions become more similar to those experienced by southern tribes. I'm curious if our panelists have thought about what these relationships and knowledge sharing would look like and what would be helpful to facilitate these connections.
Well, I guess I'll start first. I think sharing of knowledge is great and using examples of what's going on, but we've also got to recognize that there are those differences between regions. You know, when we first got on this morning, I showed a picture of, you know, my view, and we have a lot of green up, and everybody's talking about how it's still, you know, so much colder everywhere else, and probably a lot more white. So you know, the knowledge and the concepts are great learning tools, but sometimes, you know, sometimes there's a miss because there's not that relation, because it's either different species or different types of habitats and so forth, so on. So I think, again, it's great to share, and the concepts definitely provide, you know, some stepping stones. But sometimes there's some alterations, and because of those habitat changes and species changes.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think that's a great idea. That's an idea we talked a lot about when we were developing the tribal adaptation menu, is as these relatives might shift their ranges, you know, developing relationships with other communities that know those beings, and learning how they interact with them, how they interact with other beings, and, you know, developing relationships here with them. So we talked about that in the context of non-local beings, or invasive species, you know, beings moving up that some might view as negative, but, you know, trying to develop relationships with them and learning from the communities that those beings came from.
And I'll just add, I think there's even opportunity, even if, you know, not north-south, there's differences that, you know, communities are already experiencing, and just creating a platform for people to meet each other and share. You know, we just had a conversation with tribal resource managers, states, and researchers on cool and cold water fish management, and sort of what people were doing, just, you know, and I think about half the people didn't know each other, which that in itself, you know, was the start of the conversation. So making those spaces.
Yeah, I think, you know, like one thing to think about is that, you know, like we think about these big shifts from in terms of climate, you know, climate with species, but, you know, there's so much tied to sort of like much finer scale management in terms of, like, you know, in the Eastern Upper Peninsula, we have 6 or 7 major land managers that are managing, you know, 2.5 to 3 million acres. And there's all sorts of these climate gradients and ecological gradients across those you know, land holdings. And so trying to facilitate connections just locally. I mean, I can tell you examples of research that we were doing in a bay where folks were across the bay doing the same thing, and we didn't even know about it. And so, like, I do think that it's important to connect with people that are doing this work, and to sort of share understandings and information.
Yeah, it sounds like creating those spaces where people can kind of come together and share ideas, which has been so difficult in this past year, but hopefully we're all getting a little better at Zoom, but hopefully we can all be in the same room again soon. So another common theme that's come up through the summit is the important role that youth are playing in advancing climate advocacy and adaptation as well as a general call for centering future generations in all of our plans. So it's been touched on a little bit, but I was wondering if you all had examples of really how to engage the youth in protecting and preserving animal relative communities and bridging generations with tribal elders and knowledge holders.
I can sort of take a stab at starting to answer that question, I guess. You know, we don't do a lot of direct work engaging children or kids out in our field work, but you know, one of the things that we've been really trying to work on is sort of bringing with this fire project that we've got with the Forest Service, we've been doing winter pre-COVID. We were doing winter storytelling, you know, gatherings where the focus was around sort of these ecological relationships between fire and boreal ecosystems, and you know, the Anishinaabe stories are so rich with so much ecological information about these systems, and sort of bringing kids into that environment and helping them learn those creation stories connects them with this place here in a really important way. And so, you know, I think that's something that we've made a focus, and I do see connections made with specific children that are in there. So.
With my example, or with my experience working with youth, I found that us as professionals, we tend to get closed box, you know, like this is the way it's going to be, this is the way it's going to be, this is the only way it's going to work. And involving those youth actually provide, you know, things outside the box that we've never thought of before, that might be simpler, might be easier. So I see them as a valuable tool. And with this Youth Conservation Corps that we've reestablished, we've been able to utilize those youth, even if it's only for 4 weeks of a year. It's 4 weeks of, you know, providing the opportunity to have a voice in something that they otherwise would not provide, you know, any input in. So.
Yeah, and I'll just chime in. I think for, you know, we're all interested in sort of getting youth outside, sort of exposed. Dr. Wildcat spoke to this. I think for those who are interested, seeing that there are career opportunities and paths, if they do want to sort of have an active role in the protection of natural resources, and facilitating that path for them is important as well, through like the Youth Conservation Corps or undergraduate or graduate training opportunities, and to do it in a way that is respectful of their upbringing and, you know, integrates multiple ways of knowing, so that, you know, they are comfortable and see a path forward. So.
Yeah, in our climate change program, we don't do a lot with youth either, but we do have interns every year, college student interns. And then at Glyphwick as a whole, we have a public information office that does a lot of outreach to schools. And I think that's a really important component, is getting these ideas out to young kids early, you know, climate change, Indigenous knowledge, all of these things, you know, start them young, get them outside so they learn to care about the environment. We have some youth groups involved in things like, we do a garlic mustard pull every year and get youth involved in that. I think monitoring projects are excellent for getting youth involved, or any hands-on field work that might engage them and be maybe a future career path, but anything outside and active.
Looks like we still don't have questions from the audience, but I was wondering if any of the panelists have questions for each other with our kind of last 4 minutes of the session. I can ask more questions. I have lots more questions, don't worry. I was particularly wondering, I think, Eric, you mentioned it a little bit about changes in harvest, particularly thinking about changes in harvest practices in terms of timing and numbers. And I was wondering how you anticipate these will change in the future and what information and knowledge you're using to inform changes in harvest practices.
So, I think, in terms of how we handle like thinking about changes in harvest practices, we in the department, we're in a lot of ways, we're really focused on thinking about things like bag limits and season lengths and things like that, right? When we think about changing harvest. And I will say that, it's like one like, just to use snowshoe hare as an example, one important way that members harvest snowshoe hares with snaring. In order to be able to snare snowshoe hares, you have to be able to identify their runways or the places that they use. In order to do that, you have to have sustained snow for extended periods. And so, the sort of most productive and probably historically the most common way to harvest snowshoe hares was with these snares. And if climate projections for snow cover continue the way that the models suggest, then that might be a practice that just really isn't effective anymore. And so even if you can keep snowshoe hare on the landscape, there are harvest methodologies that are specifically tied to these climate conditions that we see and ones that we see at specific times of the year. So
I guess I can ask a question for someone. I don't know, it might be, I'm not sure who would answer the question, but is there space, I assume, for stories to evolve, right? So you talked about the sucker, I forgot who was talked about the sucker and the poplar, right? Are those stories able currently to evolve, or what are some of the challenges for that to continue to persist, right? As an oral tradition to respond to the changes in climate?
Yeah, I was the one that talked about that. I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer that question, but I think that the thing with those indicators, like the popple example, is that they've held true for so long, and those stories have been true for so long, and only recently have they begun to shift. So I don't know if I can say a lot more than that, but there are other people present in the Zoom meeting that might be able to answer that better.
And everyone has the ability to unmute themselves if they want to chime in too in the audience.
And Eric, you spoke to it a good bit too. That's sort of.
I think it's interesting. Like I think the stories and the connections to those stories is in some ways is a lot like our understanding of forest management, right? Like I think I like Hannah, I think there are probably people that are much better to respond to the actual stories and how those evolve than I do. But the one thing I'll say is that one of the things that we talk that I guess I talk a lot about is all these things that we've known about snowshoe hare or American marten or all these things for all these years, this whole body of knowledge. It's like it doesn't necessarily apply moving forward, and I think that that's an interesting challenge, both from Anishinaabe and Western science perspectives, is how do you capture that moving forward, and how do you try to anticipate how do we pass this knowledge down to our kids when we can't, the things that we have come to know we can't seem to count on anymore. So
I think that's really, I would say, powerful note to kind of wrap up on. So I wanted to thank all of you so much for taking the time and really giving a great overview of resiliency for our animal relatives and giving us a lot to think about. And thank you, attendees. I put a survey link in the chat. You'll also get it emailed out to you if you don't get a chance to click on it now. And we're just asking attendees to fill out a quick survey on every session. So thank you all.